Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We invite you to take your seats. We're about to begin today's presentation. So my name is Nikki Samuel, and I'm the program coordinator at the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office. I'd like to begin by thanking the catering staff that provided our delicious lunch that I hoped you all enjoyed, and that you're now full and ready to engage in some critical discussions this afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking those of you present with us here today, as well as those of you that will be joining us via the live stream link. We're very excited to have you all. But before I begin, I would like to share some general housekeeping. The women's and men's bathroom are just right through the doors on the left, and for the accessible as well as the all-gender washroom, they're one floor below us. It's located across from the Great Hall, using the right set of staircases. So just to gently remind everyone, today's event is being live streamed and recorded. As such, please ensure your cell phones are on vibrate or silent, and that you use the microphones during the Q&A session. Now I'd like to invite Jody Glean, Director of the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, to provide the statement of acknowledgement of traditional land, as well as the opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming Jody to the stage.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I would like to begin my remarks by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit River. I am grateful to be able to work and raise a family on this land. As a Black woman, an immigrant, and an equity and anti-racism practitioner, I continuously reflect on my responsibility to truth and reconciliation, and I invite you to engage in some reflection at this moment on your responsibilities to truth and reconciliation. Discussions on race, racism, and racial equity are not always easy, but they are undoubtedly necessary. We must continue to be relentless in expanding the dialogue and action planning on advancing equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces at the University of Toronto and the post-secondary arena in general. An essential ingredient to establishing an inclusive environment within an organization is to have a clear understanding of the institutional responsibilities to addressing race-based human rights complaints. But if you know me, you know that I always say the institution is not a robotic machine. The institution is each and every one of us. You and I must know and fulfill our responsibilities. That's why I'm so delighted, grateful, and humbled to see such interest in today's session. One of the main goals of the speaker series was to connect these important discussions that have been taking place for years within U of T with our local and global communities to reinforce, to expand, and to grow. So thank you once again for joining us this morning, and I look forward to the very important dialogue that lies ahead.
Thank you, Jody, for those remarks. I would like to introduce John Monahan, Warden of Hart House and co-sponsor of today's events, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, and good day, everybody. It's a real pleasure for Hart House to be collaborating with the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office on this session of this very important speaker series. And I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Shaheen Azmi has worked in various capacities with the Ontario Human Rights Commission for 20 years. For the last 10 of those years, he has been director of the Policy, Education, Monitoring, and Outreach branch, where he supervised the development of several key Ontario Human Rights Commission policies and guides, including its key data collection guide Count me in, collecting human rights-based data. In addition, Shaheen has led the development of the OHRC's Human Rights Organizational Change Program, which, if you are familiar with the Commission, has been significant in scale and scope. And Shaheen supervised key initiatives in the law enforcement, corrections, and education sectors. Prior to joining the Commission, Shaheen completed his PhD and, in fact, completed all of his university studies at the University of Toronto. His PhD is in social work. His academic research and writing has focused on human rights and discrimination and ethno-racial and religious diversity in human services and social welfare. And as we were having a bite of lunch before beginning this session, I turned to him and I said, so you know what's in your formal bio. Is there something about you that would be particularly interesting for today's crowd? And he said, well, you might just mention that I feel at home here because I have gone to school here for many years. I feel particularly at home in Harthouse, which was nice for me to hear, because he spent a lot of time here as a student and as a member of the Muslim community in Toronto. And he also is a father of U of T students. Some of his 9 children have attended here as well. So as he comes to the podium today, he does have a sense of who we are and what it is to be at the University of Toronto. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Shaheen Azmi.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I'm surprised at how many people are interested. I'm glad to see it, but a bit surprised. So I've been asked to speak about, not myself, responding to race-based human rights complaints and understanding institutional responsibility. So as part of this, I'm going to talk about, coordinate myself, the code and organizational responsibility, racism and racial discrimination, systemic discrimination, organizational best practices, and key concerns in higher education. So these are all packaged for me. If I'm asked the question of how to respond to race-based human rights complaints, it's all of this which is necessary for a university, for an academic institution. They're all connected in some way to dealing with human rights complaints. And let me go over the core of that, the code and organizational responsibility. So as a starting point, I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with the basic human rights infrastructure in this province, but some of you are not. So I'm going to sort of summarize some key ideas that some are already familiar with, but I'm hoping that others will be patient. So the Human Rights Code in Ontario has primacy over other legislation. So whatever legislation exists in Ontario, the code has primacy over it unless the piece of legislation specifically states otherwise. So the Education Act, the acts that govern the university, the various other kinds of legislation, you can think of any of this kind of legislation. All of these must give deference to the Human Rights Code and its obligations. And any institution acting on these other pieces of legislation needs to appreciate and understand the role of the code as being supreme over those pieces of legislation. The code is also remedial, meaning that its aim is to remedy problems, remedy issues that have come forward. It's not to punish individuals, it's to remedy what's going on. But that can amount to quite significant powers. Human rights complaints, when they're filed and there are findings of discrimination, adjudicators can order significant remedies far beyond what might just be a simple punishment terms. So we've had remedies, for example, of significant requirements for organizational change, multi-year initiatives on the part of major institutions that actually cost those institutions millions of dollars because of violations of the code that have been complained and findings of discrimination have taken place. So there is potentially very significant power and impact behind human rights complaints. And of course, the code looks at intent, effect, but not intent. So this is really central to a lot of issues dealing with racism and racial discrimination. A lot of people often say or do things that they believe are innocuous, not discriminatory, not racist, but the intent is actually irrelevant to the finding of discrimination. The discrimination will be rooted in the effect that it has and whether it objectively is discriminatory. So the intent is not a relevant factor in findings of discrimination. And the code, of course, is provincial. The university environment is a provincial governed environment, so almost all matters dealing with universities, employment, service delivery, come to the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal for Complaints and the Commission, and are not to other jurisdictions like the Federal Human Rights Commission. Now, also the code covers 5 social areas and 17 protected grounds. So I'm just going to, this is the wider landscape within which race-related complaints takes place and race issues come up. Basically, the 5 social areas are employment, housing, service, goods and facilities, contracts, membership in unions or professional associations. And so any complaint that takes place must fall within one of these 5 social areas for it to be a legitimate complaint before the tribunal. If it's in other environments outside of these 5 social areas, say something happens on the streets of Toronto. If something happens on the streets, it's not within the 5 social areas, a human rights complaint cannot be filed in relationship to that. There are 17 protected grounds of the Human Rights Code. And you'll notice at the top of the list on the left side are what we call race-related grounds. Race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, creed. These are the race-related human rights complaints grounds. And when we're talking about race discrimination, race complaints, they must in some way link up with one of these 6 grounds. The reality is that they often overlap. People, when they discriminate on the basis of race, harass on the basis of race, aren't trying to specify exactly what they mean. They're really often just got an amalgam of an idea of somebody's identity, and they are, based on that, behaving and acting in discriminatory ways. And so they often overlap, and we don't make that huge a distinction between them. If you file a complaint and you simply said the term race and didn't tick off the other boxes, that would be fine. That would be acceptable at the tribunal. There are, of course, many other grounds of the Human Rights Code, all of which are relevant in university environments. The others are all listed there. Given the focus of today, I'm going to spend more time talking about race and race-related complaints. The Complaint Commission also, the Complaint Code itself obligates institutional responsibility to uphold the Human Rights Code. So this is, of course, very important for an institution like a university in that it's saying whatever happens on the ground is not something you can look the other way at. Universities have obligations. Employers, service providers in this province have obligations. They must act when they see concerns from a human rights viewpoint. If they don't, there will be consequences that they might face. This deals with all kinds of issues, complaints, and how you handle complaints, and how you're preventing issues of complaints, how you're dealing with the various structures in your organization. As we go through today and the rest of the presentation, you'll all basically be identifying the kinds of things, issues, concerns that universities need to be mindful of when they are trying to address their human rights obligations and responsibilities. Now, I have to emphasize that a university community is actually a place where all of these social areas apply and virtually all of these grounds apply. So as a university, you're a place where you're an employer, you're a service provider, you're a housing provider, you're contracting all the time, and within your organized institution, there are unions operating and professional associations operating. And while you don't have responsibility directly for them, they have responsibilities under the Human Rights Code to uphold as well. So this is an environment where all of the complex elements of the code apply and need to be understood well. And as I said, all of the grounds also apply. So that sort of sets the stage of the legal requirements of what is expected here under the Human Rights Code. I'm going to shift to speaking more specifically about racism and racial discrimination. just to make sure we're all speaking the same language and about the same issues. So the Commission has a policy on racism and racial discrimination. That policy was developed more than 10 years ago, but the key concepts within it are very relevant today, and a lot of the development of the Commission's work around organizational obligations and responsibilities and systemic discrimination really flow from work coming out of the policy on racism and racial discrimination. That's because when we consulted with people across Ontario on issues of racism and racial discrimination, most people from racialized communities were saying to us, while harassment and the various types of interpersonal discrimination do affect us and are significant concerns, the things that concern us the most is the lack of opportunities, is the barriers we have to economic and academic and success in society, which are institutional in nature. So that the focus really quickly became are the things that need to be done on institutional context to help address racism and racial discrimination, because that's the environment that racialized people most feel is the environment where they're being impeded and affected severely. So this is why we have taken a lot of steps following that policy on racism and racial discrimination and really then honed in on systemic discrimination and organizational change. Almost all of our organizational change work comes out of work primarily dealing with discrimination based on race and related grounds. So these concepts, race and racialization, are the core concepts that underlie any work on racism and racial discrimination. Race, it must be absolutely clear, is not biological. We're not talking about biological concepts of race. We're talking about social constructs of race. And social constructs mean that racialization can go much further than what is traditionally understood to be race. So, for example, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which are really rooted in creed distinctions, have been interpreted by the Commission policies as well as by many others in the study area to be types of racism because they carry within them a lot of dimensions of racialization. So that is an important concept that everybody needs to understand when we're talking about racism and racial discrimination. Also, racialization is a concept that really goes very far in where it can reach in terms of marginalization of groups. Racialization means the construction of people as different in terms of, quote, race, in ways that are meaningful and impactful. And those particular distinctions are at the root of what ultimately follows in terms of marginalization and discrimination. And things that come into the scope of racialization then go beyond just skin color and just physical features. They could include clothing and accent and the way people speak generally. There's a lot associated with things like race and ancestry and place of origin that really go well beyond the physical character of the person. And that's racialization understood. Racialization is the key concept then when we're not talking about racism in a very abstract, broad sense, we're really talking about racialization. Now, in a response to understanding racialization, I have to say also that there is a flip side to racialization. Racialization assumes that there is a center point, a standard from which distinction is made. And fundamentally, when we speak of racialization, we're implying white privilege in Canada and North America. If people are being marginalized because of distinctions associated in some way with their race, ethnic origin, and the other kind of code grounds, it's because they're being marginalized from a center point that's deemed to be a standard and a center. So white privilege is implied when racialization takes place. It's the very idea that you're marginalizing groups because of, quote, social constructs of race, that somebody is doing that. Some group, some central body is doing that. And that central body, because it's not exposed to the very same racialization, is itself the center stage that is then free from all the inhibitions that racialization imply. So that is essentially white privilege. That's the core of what white privilege is. White privilege is not fundamentally criticizing white people for what they've done, what their parents have done, what has been the history. It's basically about benefits they receive simply by inheriting a certain physical feature. And that physical feature is given preference within wider Canadian society. For non-whites in Canada, especially for people will know this who've been in Canada for generations from racialized backgrounds, they'll know that they'll never be fully considered Canadian, not yet at least, not in our time of history. I know people whose ancestors go back to the 1800s, from Chinese backgrounds, from black backgrounds, and so on. Till this day, they will still be considered foreign and will have perceived many circumstances in where that perception of being foreign has impeded their success in some way within Canadian society. That's, again, a privilege of white privilege, because you're not exposed to that. And white immigrants to Canada benefit from that simply because they don't have to go that extra hurdle of proving that they are Canadian in some way because of their looks. Now, we go in our policy to talk about racism. Now, we looked at many definitions, and we ultimately decided that no one single definition fits the grade pretty well. But we did decide on a few factors that are very important to understand what racism is. And these are the 4 factors that we've fixed on: an ideology of inherent superiority, beliefs that are unconsciously held, that can be deeply embedded in systems, and are associated with the power to act on the belief. So this is a sort of technical way of looking at racism. I know from working in the field for many, many years that most people actually don't have a very precise idea what racism is. It's often an amalgam, and sometimes they use it as a simile for discrimination per se. So racism is these things. It's a type of ism that there are other kinds of isms like that, and other kinds of isms will have similar kinds of frameworks, sentences that underline them. Now, racism in Canada has an interesting kind of social understanding. In Canada, because we have a mythology that Canada is not a racist country. It's a country where people are colorblind, or people will say that. But if you look at the history of Canada, and you look at the experiences of many racialized groups, it's just not factual. There have been many people in Canada who have been racialized, who've been exposed to some of the worst atrocities that you can imagine. Indigenous people are probably the prime example of that, but African Canadians, Japanese Canadians, Chinese Canadians, Jewish Canadians, you can go around the list on this. There are many people who have experienced horrible experiences of racism in Canadian society. Canada, you could say officially, was a racist society up till about 1960. Many of its laws, many of its policies and practices were openly discriminatory to non-white people. So that's just part of what Canada historically has been. Until this day, we have many human rights issues relating to racism and racial discrimination. Lots of them that we cover. The Commission's work, I would say half of the Commission's work currently is dealing with issues of racism and racial discrimination. Racism is a thing that can be identified at many levels: individual, institutional, societal. And it's at all these levels that one has to be working at if you're trying to truly address the problems of racism. I'd note particularly the insignificant influence of societal level influences of racism. So that's where it's really rooted, in intellectual expressions, ideological expressions, in media, in entertainment industry. A lot of racism is sort of amalgamated there in the form of stereotypes. And there it's very hard to deal with. It's very hard to pull out and address. Generally speaking, human rights legislation, charter, they apply at the level of the institution and the individual. You can file human rights claims against institutions, against individuals. You cannot do so against society, broadly speaking. So it's an ism that is a very intangible, difficult thing to address. And while you address it at the level of an institution, it may reform and reappear in that same institution a few years later, because the wider context in which this is all taking place is the broader society and not the institution itself. Now, we make a really key distinction in our policy, which I think is one of the biggest lessons that anti-racism activists can use and understand. Racial discrimination is actually a tangible thing. It's a legal thing. It's something that you can actually address through courts and tribunals, whereas racism, you can't. If you're trying to struggle against racism, one of the primary ways to do so will be to shape up and frame racism as it appears in institutions as racial discrimination. And if you can do that, you can take the next step of actually taking legal action to force movement. This has been the primary way in which work against racism has actually advanced over the last few decades. Simply by identifying behavior that was considered in the past mundane, normal, and deeming it to be racial discrimination and filing human rights claims, that's what's changed a lot of what's gone on. If you think about day-to-day practices of racial jokes and racial slurs, things that were and remain common in many environments across Ontario, those things, you can actually shape them up as discrimination. And institutions as being irresponsible and not addressing poison environment. By doing that over the last few decades, a lot of this kind of behavior has been pushed in the sides of most institutional behavior. It's a no-go zone now to harass people on the basis of race and use racial slurs and the like. It may still happen, but there's clear understanding broadly across institutions that it's not acceptable. Now, we have a definition for racial discrimination. It's a legal definition. It's basically that at the end of the day, when all this evidence is considered, is it more likely or not that race was a factor in the adverse treatment experience? In this, key terms are sort of highlighted. The key term here, I would really focus on adverse treatment. Adverse treatment must be objectively adverse. It cannot simply be subjectively understood that. It must be objectively understood to be adverse. If it is adverse and it's connected in some way to the race, then that shapes as racial discrimination when it's in the context of an employment or a service provision. Intent, again, is not necessary, and it's very important to note that people of all backgrounds can racially discriminate. It might be racialized people themselves who discriminate against other racialized people. So it's common phenomena that exists out there. There are many different types of racial discrimination. In our policy work, we sort of define these, give some examples to illustrate them, because the shape and frame of racial discrimination has evolved, has changed. The understanding of what existed in the past has evolved. And just so this list would show you how it's evolved and changed. Harassment, simple concept defined in the Human Rights Code. Years ago, you could have said all kinds of things in work environments that would not have been deemed harassment. But through human rights jurisprudence, it's been deemed to be harassment, and it's a type of racial discrimination, racial harassment. Poison environment, another type. Language-based race discrimination is an interesting example of where the Commission was asked to look at discrimination faced by people who, when they applied for positions, even by phone or for housing, they would speak with their accents, or they would speak with a tone which was suggestive of their quote racialized identity. That would be potentially a source of discrimination, and we discovered many examples of accent-based discrimination, complaints that would be filed on that, and we now understand that to be a type of race discrimination. There are Canadian experience requirements, a very interesting example. For decades in Ontario, Canadian experience requirements were standard in job ads. And at some point, about 7, 8 years ago, the Commission was asked to look at, well, are Canadian experience requirements acceptable? Are they non-discriminatory? And from when we looked at it, it was pretty clear to us that Canadian experience requirements are generally racial discrimination because they are simply proxies for other things. In generally speaking, the idea is that you can get your experience anywhere in the world. But the real criteria is whether you have ability to do a job or not have ability to do a job. And that is not based on where you learn how to do it. It's based on your ability to do it. And that can be acquired in many environments. We checked with regulatory bodies, we checked with employers, we asked them, give us an example of a bona fide context in which where you learn how to do something was a factor in your actual ability to do that work. And till this day, we've not seen an example of that being a real concern. So we came up with a policy on Canadian experience requirements saying that it was essentially a type of racial discrimination. So since that policy has come out, you will not have seen many such examples. There's very few cases now where Canadian experience requirements are advanced as a qualification for employment. Profiling, racial profiling is a big concern, and there's been a lot of work that the Commission has done on racial profiling by law enforcement, by authority figures, and so that's a type of racial discrimination that we really focus on extensively. Subtle racial discrimination is discrimination that takes place behind the scenes, where decisions are made where nobody's even aware that it affects them. So resume screening, for example, is an example of that. Screening of applications is another example. Those kind of subtle decisions made behind the scenes are very common things we know. From many social scientific studies we've seen, it's really clear that there's significant amounts of name discrimination, place discrimination, identity discrimination that takes place because of the differential impacts upon people who have exactly the same kind of qualifications. And then systemic discrimination is a sort of amalgam of forms of discrimination, which I'm going to go in a little more detail in as we go further in this presentation. The Commission, just to give you an example of what comes up before the tribunal in Ontario, you'll see that the disability claims represent about 56% of human rights claims. And this has got a lot to do with ability to file complaints, because the knowledge of that you've been discriminated against. With race discrimination, you often don't know. And this is why it's less common. However, race discrimination, if you added up all the grounds, all the race-related grounds, and some of them will overlap. The numbers here will not add up to 100. They overlap because in one complaint you can identify more than one ground. So if you looked at all the race-related complaints and just said which are race-related complaints, it's about 30-35% of complaints. So the second largest area of human rights complaints currently is race-related complaints. And in the history of the human rights system in Ontario, it's always been number 1 or number 2. So that's a lot of complaints. That means in Ontario, about 1,000 complaints every year are filed at the Human Rights Tribunal based on race. And the other grounds are obviously significant grounds, but they are just numerically much smaller in number. Now, here's a listing of some of the key OHRC policies that are available relating to this: language, racism and racial discrimination, Canadian experience, creed, racial profiling, law enforcement, which is our most recent policy that just came out. We also provide e-learning resources relating to racial discrimination. So we've done a lot of work around race, and it continues to be one of our biggest themes. So I want to move quickly to discuss systemic discrimination and then organizational responsibilities. So one of the things that I've mentioned is that racialized people often fix on systemic discrimination as the primary concern. And when we looked at systemic discrimination as a concept and as an idea, we found that it is a very challenging thing to address, largely because what often is systemically discriminatory is normalized within institutions. Behavior, patterns of behavior, decisions, policies, procedures, all of these things look innocuous to the average person looking at them. It's when they're looked at from a critical viewpoint, from a distinct viewpoint, that this systemic discrimination that's implied within them becomes clear. And that's a challenging thing for people to do, especially if they are a myopic kind of institution that is looking at themselves and trying to correct themselves. So this is a real challenge in every environment, not just any one of them, but every environment. A lot of our work around systemic discrimination has been in the context of policing and law enforcement. In policing, all kinds of decisions, all kinds of behavior are customary practices, things that have been done in policing in Canada for 100 years. And they don't look discriminatory. They don't look racist. They look like the good policing. And police leaders and the average police person looking at them will say, there's nothing wrong with this. This is the way we do it. This is the way it's to be done. It takes a very critical eye to look at the way people do things and say, in fact, is that really bona fide? Is that something that makes sense? And it doesn't in many cases. Just an example of that, in the 60s and 70s, before the 70s, in policing, there were weight and height requirements. Weight and height requirements essentially said you had to be a certain weight, certain height, because the understanding of policing was you had to be a big, strong person to essentially beat up another person if you had to, right? That was what a police officer was by definition. And that was a perfectly understood as a normalized, that's the way it needs to be. That ultimately was challenged in human rights complaints by women and by racialized people from communities from racialized backgrounds who are smaller in stature. And when it was challenged, it was very quickly determined by human rights tribunals, yeah, that's discriminatory because you don't have to be 6 foot tall and 200 pounds to be a police officer. There are many countries in the world that have police officers who are by normally only 5'2" or 5'4" or 5'5" and so on, and they police. So it's not a fundamental requirement of policing. It was a normalized custom. There are many such normalized customs found everywhere till this day that just haven't been challenged. If they were challenged, many of these could be deemed to be discriminatory. So we have a legal definition of systemic discrimination, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on talking about, but it has core elements to it which lead to what we put together as a diagnostic model for systemic discrimination. So what we did in our policy work on racism was to say, okay, we know systemic discrimination is challenging to address. It's hard to actually uncover normalized practices that in the end are really discriminatory. And the way to do that is then to put together the viewpoints that allow you to actually identify practices that are discriminatory, but you're just not aware of them. And from this definition, which is the legal definition that's been employed in case law for the last 25 years, this definition is sort of a basis upon which we've developed specific diagnostic approaches to identify systemic discrimination. And we've identified 3 considerations for identifying and assessing systemic discrimination. One is numerical data. Second is policies, practices, and decision-making processes. And the third is organizational culture. So if you went back to that definition, you'd see reference points to behavior, to policies, to practices. And so essentially we've broken it down into areas in which you focus attention to identify what amounts to adverse impacts by race. And in policies, practices, and procedures, we say look at formal and informal practices. You look at what apparently is neutral but conceal deeply embedded systemic discrimination. And there needs to be a very active process of critically assessing these things. Now, for example, informal or highly discretionary approaches, subjective methods of assessment are really prone to racial bias and racial discrimination. In employment practices, if you don't have good, rigorous employment systems that are founded in human resource principles, you leave a lot of room for bias to intervene, and that can become a very systemic action. Just by not having good formal human resource practices, that itself is a systemic barrier, systemic bias, and can be deemed to be discriminatory. Organizational culture are patterns of informal social behavior that reflect deeply held and unconscious values and behavioral norms. So organizational culture is more amorphous than policies, practices, and procedures. They're like the flesh of a body. The policies, practices, and procedures are like the skeleton. The flesh is a little softer, a little more difficult to get at. But they are very impactful in how they impede people's success in institutions and organizations. So there is a sense of normality, a source of a fit that sort of becomes a part of a culture that is reinforced by a culture, which can only be addressed if you look at the culture critically, if you actually shape up the culture and see where the adverse impacts flow from that. And if you do that consciously, you can actually uncover all kinds of things that have, from the viewpoint of people with different code identities, have real adverse impacts. In terms of race, there are many such examples that have come up. Just by, for example, in policing, where we've done a lot of the work here, policing environment, because it's largely a white male environment, even till this day in most police services, racialized people really stand out. And they stand out as being different, and they stand out as being somehow not perfectly in the groove. Police have a lot of networks that operate outside of the workplace. They have family policing communities. They have participation in similar religious and social activities, and they are often connected to each other. That network itself acts as a barrier to people who don't fit into the picture. So that's a big part of what happens in policing that relates to employment and also to service delivery. Numerical data is the one that perhaps is a little more difficult to see, but numerical data is understood to be an essential component to diagnosing systemic discrimination because you're looking for significant impacts. You're looking for impacts that are patterns of outcomes. So you're really looking for outcome data to identify anomalies, patterns that are things that you have difficulty explaining. So just for example, in Toronto, if the Toronto Fire Department has 95% white males working as firefighters, that's an anomaly, right? Compared to the wider population. Why should that be the case? Well, then you have to ask the question, why is the case? And if you connect it to organizational culture, and you connect it to policies, practices, and procedures, and findings of adverse impacts there, you have the ability then to diagnose direct impacts of actual behavior, actual policies, practices, and procedures that are creating that scenario. And largely that's where you can root these things, because there have been a lot of talk about diversity. There's been a lot of talk about efforts to try to diversify the work populations in many settings, and many of these suffer from many years of lack of success. In policing, there's been decades of trying to diversify police services in this country. And they've largely failed because even though they've tried to recruit people, they've had a hard time retaining people within those institutions because they do not stay if the environment is corrosive from their viewpoint. So numerical data is in fact really critical. For this reason, the Commission has put out guidance on data collection for relating to human rights, affirming first that it is legal and it is a good thing to do when it is guided correctly and operationalized correctly, and that the onus actually exists upon institutions to fulfill their institutional obligations to collect data based upon Human Rights Code identifiers where concerns have been raised. So if racist concerns of racism have been raised, if concerns of other kinds of discrimination have been raised, then there's actually an onus to collect data on that, just as you would to try to address any failings, any limitations, any problems. How do you do it? You study it. You try to figure out what the problem is, and you actually try to determine the degree of the problem, where it's sourced. And data collection is a big part of doing that. For that reason, the Commission has provided practical guidance on race-based data collection on our guide, Count Me In. And we're starting to see in Ontario now, in response to that guide came out almost 10 years ago now. We have just now starting to see movement on race-based data collection. The Anti-Racism Directorate was established a few years ago. It established a race data standard, and it has established obligations by regulation of various types of institutions to collect data. In policing, we've been trying to push police services to collect stop data, racial police outcome data based on race since 15 years ago. And now we have one police service in the province that collects race data based on stops, the Ottawa Police Service, and that was based on a human rights settlement. And we still don't have other services. We've started to see commitments from the Toronto Police Service and others to do so now, but it's been 15 years of pushing the idea and the concerns and pressure from communities and human rights complaints to say, you actually have to do this because you got to tell us that you're serious about trying to address these issues. Now, shifting from systemic discrimination to organizational practices. Obviously, if you are a responsible organization, you're trying to address concerns as they come up. Diagnosing systemic discrimination is part of that. And a good organizational best practices incorporates understandings of systemic discrimination and ideas to try to diagnose these things. And then there are a lot of other things that we have learned over the years of specific practices that are helpful to try to address systemic discrimination. So I'm going to list some of these core ideas that we've uncovered. We have a guidebook on organizational change for police. largely done through the work developed after our work with police services. And a lot of these ideas have been transferred to other environments, so we've seen them used in all kinds of settings. Now, I think the university here probably is a more sophisticated organization in trying to address organizationally its obligations, but every organization has limitations and failings that it needs to address. So I may address things that at the university environment you've done a lot of these things, and some of these things you probably haven't done as much as you probably need to. So first of all, just understanding what human rights organizational change is, what responsibilities organizations have, and what they're aiming for. It's really a change effort over multiple years. There is no single intervention that works to really fulfill human rights obligations for an organization. That's because there are so many biases and prejudices and customs that are built in that are discriminatory by their nature. So there's a lot that needs to be worked on in trying to move an organization forward to uphold its human rights obligations. But just to have that as the goal is to create a capacity to identify human rights issues, address human rights issues proactively as an outcome that is sustained forever, because these issues never die. Human rights issues, you imagine that you might be able to deal with them once and finish them off, but we've been working and dealing with issues of racism for hundreds of years, and that still hasn't died down. It's not going to easily die down. It needs work on an ongoing basis. And basically, what the goal is to get the organization to a stage and capacity that it anticipates and understands things as they're happening, and even when they're not framed already by human rights tribunals and courts as discrimination. Because there's always new things coming up that could easily fly under the context of racial discrimination. We have uncovered in our work that organizational change around human rights work actually needs very careful organizational change work. It's almost the best practice of human rights change work is what's needed to actually make human rights work happen. A lot of efforts fail simply because the process of change is not full, is not complete, is not the best possible. In the various examples that we've worked on, these 9 different elements have to be there in very strong measure for you to actually succeed with organizational change in human rights work. And key amongst them is resistance. There's always resistance to change, but there's a lot more resistance to human rights change because they are often embedded deeply within people's personal impressions and understandings and biases, and in institutional structures that are established for many, many years. And the resistance is going to be a lot stronger to deal with human rights matters, especially cutting-edge kind of matters, than other kind of matters. You actually have to anticipate, build on, deal with resistance in a very conscious fashion. This itself is a huge discussion in itself, which I'm not going to have time to cover. However, well, there has been many experiences now to establish organizational capacity for human rights. A lot of things have been learned. There have been things that are core in their nature, core elements, like a core infrastructure that an institution has to have to be able to deal with human rights matters. And there are kind of specific initiatives, specific kind of programs that can be taken up on the sides of this, that needs to be taken up on the sides of this, because every institution has its unique set of problems and issues, and the core work is not necessarily dealing with all those specific issues. So let me just give you some illustrations of that. The core elements of any human rights project, anti-racism work, are always going to involve some kind of human rights accommodation policy development. So good policies that are just not on paper, but that are actually operationalized and that have real teeth and understanding. Reviewing policies and procedures that exist to consider their human rights implications. So all institutions have, major institutions have lots of policies, lots of procedures, lots of guidances. Hidden in the midst of these things often are various adverse impacts that need to be looked at in a very specific fashion, in a systematic fashion. So that often means looking at policies you wouldn't even consider relevant to human rights. But human rights, as you remember from the social areas, is employment, is service delivery, is housing, it's contracts, it's all over the place, right? So within an institution, there needs to be an effort to actually look at all these kind of policies that are governing these things to identify adverse impacts. Inclusive design reviews are a type of review that are a little broader than policies and procedures. Inclusive design reviews actually looks at organizational culture as well. So you're looking at how cultures shape up and whether they're inclusive or not. Communication, publicizing, reporting on human rights commitments. So one of the most important things for institutions to do is actually state clearly that they acknowledge and understand their human rights obligations and are making efforts to address them. It sets a bar of accountability. It says you're saying you're going to do something, and people out there will then know that it's okay to hold you accountable for those things. So just that is a very important element of an effort to address human rights. Human rights related complaint procedures. There can maybe many different types. Taking advantage of complaint processes to identify human rights concerns, systemic concerns, and then being able to react to them and find potentially people who are motivated to help you address these things. The complaints are one of the most useful things you can use to actually address human rights matters. In the world of anti-racism, that's one of the ways it's done. It's almost always institutions react when somebody complains and actually then start thinking about, well, what can we do about this? It's a problem. Collecting identifier data. This is that whole piece around data collection, right? So a core activity, needs to be a core activity, is to actually create data collection regimes that are focused on human rights matters. So not just any data collection, but data collection that clearly has a human rights purpose built into it. We also have a number of employment initiatives that have been identified as very important employment initiatives. So a staff census, this is identify who works for you in large institutions. Focused recruitment and promotion from underrepresented groups. Exit surveys to include human rights focus, and affinity groups. Affinity groups are like networks of people from similar backgrounds. So in different settings, this means different things. In a university environment, of course, it means a very different thing than it does, for example, in a police service. But the ideas are very similar. Your diversity and inclusion is part of human rights obligations. And creating systems, good human resource practices, understanding who works for you, what their needs are, what their limitations are, what gaps in skills and experiences you have, is all part of good diversity and human rights work that needs to be done. And I'm running through these. I could go on a lot for each of these, right? Service delivery. So there's a lot of things that have been tried in the context of service delivery. Performance management of people. So this is actually connected to service. You're actually connecting a human rights, inclusion, diversity kind of component to performance management tools and assessments. Collecting service data. So this is the data on the service side. Adapting community consultation activity to include human rights focus. If you meet with the world out there and you connect with them, ask them about their human rights experience with you. So this could look like surveys of communities, focus groups. Ask people who are potentially recipients of your service, and generally the range of them, the diversity of them, what their experiences are of your services from a viewpoint of human rights, of inclusion, of diversity. And developing the tools like language guides, outreach tools for hard-to-reach communities. This, again, is different for different environments. Organizing human rights and diversity-related events. Celebrating these kind of events on a regular basis is a good practice for institutions. Again, not all of this will easily apply in a university environment where there's all kinds of things happening already, but these are practices of other institutions. Training is always a component, of course, of change efforts, particularly human rights change. And it is something that is not, however, a replacement for the rest of the work. People have to really appreciate that and understand that. It's a part of it. And there are specific types of training that are very valuable. So especially in the employment context, there needs to be a real clear understanding of the Human Rights Code and its obligations. Because most people don't know this stuff, right? If I told you all the environments I've gone to, just basic human rights code, the fact that it's discrimination, and the fact that it's potentially human rights complaints, and just give examples of harassment and racial discrimination of different types. That is knowledge for most people. And that knowledge is what helps set expectations and requirements and obligations. And then specific human rights training dealing with specific issues. So many environments have particular issues of concern. So if sexual harassment, for example, is an issue of concern in the university environment, then training for students, for employees about sexual harassment, human rights obligations associated with it, all other things that you could identify to create understanding. These are just key things that need to be part of a picture of training. And for a university environment, I would really think that that's the easiest thing for you guys to do, because that's right up the alley for the work that you do. But for many institutions and organizations, they are really challenged with training. Good training, right? They can do one-off training here and there, but good training they have a real problem with. Now I'm going to lastly just touch on basically human rights issues of concern in higher education institutions that we've become aware of at the Commission. So these are three big issue sets that I'm sort of referring you to. Academic freedom versus equality rights. So this is a theme in many environments, but in your environment it comes up a lot. People's desire to express themselves freely, and sometimes their freedom of thought, expression, comes against the equality perceptions of people from various marginalized backgrounds. So, you know, people who would say indigenous people, they get what they deserve, right? That's like a viewpoint. And then the viewpoint of indigenous people, that we've been subject to systemic discrimination, societal discrimination for a long time, and that's harassing, and that's, you know, to me. That's kind of a conflict between freedom of expression and equality rights. And there's many, many, many variations to this. So it's a particularly tense issue in the university environment because of the importance of universities for freedom of expression and academic inquiry. Academic integrity and accommodation. This has come up as a common theme, particularly relating to learning disabilities and mental health disabilities. So it's been a challenge. We've got a policy on mental health, human rights and accommodation, and that policy lays out what the case standards of the law currently are, and many universities find that very challenging because they come up against issues of academic integrity and academic freedom. So there's a big set of issues that are relating to that out there currently that's still working itself out throughout the university environment. The other thing I would sort of point to is the fact that university communities are really like mini cities, especially this one. And in this environment, every space is institutional in a way, but it's also public in a way. And your streets, for example, in this area, are institutional space, and to some degree they're public space at the same time. And your washrooms are the same, right? So things happen in your environment that are out of your control, but you're still expected as an institution to uphold your responsibilities in trying to address them. And so that can be a challenge, but there are obligations. There are obligations to make efforts. You can't simply be things like, I'm passing this off because it's somebody outside the university community did. Whatever somebody does in your space effectively affects everybody in this space. And you have an obligation and responsibility to try to address it to the best of your ability. And of course, the assessment will be based on what's reasonable. You can't, of course, stop people doing things that are out of your control. But you can certainly make efforts to address these matters, redress these matters, and prevent these matters from happening through good design and good efforts. So I'm going to stop there, a bit over time, but I'll open it to questions and comments.
Testing. All right. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Azmi, for that riveting presentation. As stated, it is now time for the Q&A session. It's time for the critical dialogue. So you will see, actually, Dr. Azmi, I'm going to borrow the clicker. For those of you joining via live stream, please note that if you do you can email your questions to antiracism@utoronto.ca, We will be trying our best to collate a few of them, and we will be presenting them in this space as well to the best of our ability. To those of you in this space, though, is there anyone here who wishes to open up for the Q&A dialogue?
First of all, thank you for this expounding, very informational talk. You've left us with a lot to digest. And I'm actually having a hard time in even formulating the question that I'm about to ask, but I'll try anyways. You talked to us about a few definitions of racism, racial discrimination. You also gave us an understanding of systemic discrimination and spoke about data collection and organizational culture and all of those things. So clearly, we are operating in a very, very, very complex environment. So my question is twofold. One is, we've got a lot of data on Human Rights Tribunal and what are the cases that go up to that tribunal. Do we have enough data on how much of awareness prevails when it comes to racism, both from a higher ed perspective and from a provincial perspective? That's question number one. Number two is, how do we take that data and understand what bias exists within our own landscape, and how do we address that bias?
Okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, there is lots of data about racism at the societal level. Polls, there's many polls out there. We've done polling at the Ontario Human Rights Commission that is essentially trying to identify to what degree racism exists in the broader society and what are the groups most exposed, right? Because it's actually, racism is many different isms, right? It's different peoples that are affected in different ways, largely connected to stereotypes that are out there in broader society. So we know from this polling that a significant percentage of Canadians hold racist attitudes, right? Consciously racist attitudes. There is specific groups in Ontario and Canada that are disliked very significantly by segments of the population. So part of the challenge in Canadian society is that there's actually quite a strong hold of racism on the part of a large minority of Canadians, right? And this actually plays itself out in human rights complaints, in hate activity, in various kinds of discriminatory activity. And just as an example, in Canada we have Bill 21 in Quebec. Bill 21 is an openly discriminatory piece of legislation, right? We haven't had openly discriminatory pieces of legislation in this country for decades, right? So we do have that, and that's based upon popular support. That's the argument in support of that. So racism is a real factor, a big factor in society. That's why we have all these indicators showing it's there as complaints and so on. And what an institution like a university has to recognize is that whatever happens on the societal level is happening in the university. There are many communities, many students, many teachers who will have undoubtedly racist attitudes and beliefs. And they will express them in some way. Now, fortunately, in a university environment, you do have complaint mechanisms and you have some accountability. So when these things happen in this environment, the measure of whether there are things that you have to deal with is whether the discrimination, whether the definition of discrimination I provided applies. And I would have a very vigilant kind of effort to try to communicate that definition and to have people who are responsible within the university understand that definition and actually try to apply it when they're doing their work, when they're seeing things coming in front of their table and when issues are being raised. And if they were doing more of that, I think you would have stronger push to try to push down the forces of racism and racial discrimination.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Just building on this question, in respect of data, what trends are you seeing, if any, in respect of complaints and particularly on racial discrimination over time, over several years?
It's a good question. The numbers have consistently remain similar in terms of percentage. The kinds of complaints, there are still many just simple harassment complaints that come in. So things that a person uses racial slurs, negative derogatory commentary. This kind of behavior is still common. And many complaints focus on that. What we do see, of course, nowadays a bit more are challenges to issues that in the past were less challenged. So, for example, racial profiling. Racial profiling, going back about 15 years or so, was not a well-developed legal concept in Canada. You didn't have a lot of complaints, a lot of legal decisions around racial profiling. In the last 15 years, and largely connected to the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policy work in the area, we've seen many decisions come up, many examples of what amounts to racial profiling that have been, that police institutions in particular have found trouble accepting because so many of the practices that they sort of honed in on and fixed on for many years are questioned now as being potentially discriminatory. So I think that's been the kind of trend that we've seen, moving away from kind of direct human rights interpersonal matters, more into the institutional realm, in the systemic realm, and challenging of those things. And we've had a lot of success in identifying things that were considered normal and acceptable and deeming them, in fact, to be discrimination systemically. So I think that's a trend that is there. And it's the kind of trend that I think largely happened because the Commission in Ontario has changed. It's a system, right? The human rights system in Ontario used to have the Commission receiving human rights complaints. When that system changed about 15 years ago, the Commission became a systemic body, trying to address systemic issues, looking at patterns and behavior. So we became more fixed on those kind of issues. And we actually put together an understanding of what systemic discrimination looks like that people out there can jump on. So people can actually file claims of racial profiling against police services because they have a body of policy development and legal case law that actually supports what they're claiming. So we're starting to see more of those kind of claims.
Thank you. As the world becomes increasingly online, what is being done to adapt to racism in an online world?
So that's a great challenge, right? In Canada, we used to have, with the federal government, there used to be, in the Federal Human Rights Act, possibility of raising complaints through telecommunications, things that happened in the online world, right? And some of those things, ultimately that part of the Human Rights Act was changed under the previous government. And so that's no longer there as an option. So there is no human rights legislation now that allows for addressing just any kind of expression of racism and racial discrimination. There are certain types that might be. So for example, if somebody puts an advertisement online for a room and says, I only want people of such a background and not people from that background, that would still fall under the human rights legislation because it's kind of a service that's being advertised. So there are some things that can be addressed online, but the huge volume of material that is out there online that is hateful and discriminatory and racist is outside the scope of human rights legislation because it's basically in the territory of freedom of expression. Now, that's a big concern, and it's been an issue because a lot of what happens on the ground is being influenced by things that are happening online. And it's something that we've certainly been thinking about, but we recognize the challenges in a society that values freedom of expression as much as Canadian society does, to being able to address that in some meaningful way. So whatever can be done is I think still an open question right now. Thank you.
On that note, I actually have a question myself.
Yeah.
On the slide that was referring to defining racial discrimination, one of the words that struck me in the first bullet point was the need for evidence. And so I was wondering if you could share sort of what is defined as evidence in a sort of race-based complaint, and to be a bit more specific, I would say over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been quite a lot of conversations around racial microaggressions. And so at times gets framed as subtle discrimination as well. And given how difficult it can be to sort of raise these complaints, I'm wondering, what does evidence look like in those type of complaints?
Yeah, it's a challenge. Microaggressions could be innocuous behavior, right? It could be behavior without intention. So really you're trying to identify evidence that says that the microaggressions are actually objectively harassment. And the test will be the same test that applies to any kinds of harassment. Objectively, would a reasonable person in Ontario, seeing that behavior, deem that to be harassing? That's the basic test. And it's going to be really contextual, case by case, right? There might be patterns of behavior. If you're seeing a certain kind of negative expression, negative tone that's being done more than once, several times, in a particularly shocking fashion, the evidence will be that the behavior takes place and that the reasonable person in Ontario would deem that to be harassing. That's essentially what you have to be able to show. And it's going to be a call, right? It's going to be a call by somebody who hears the evidence on both sides. Now, because harassment does not require intent, that's why the objective requirement is there, right? So that subjectively somebody may perceive microaggression as harassment. Maybe somebody who has expressed something themselves don't think that they've done anything that is harassing, don't even think it's a microaggression, and they have some other explanation for it. All that may be part of the mix, but in the end, the test will be, would the objective person in Ontario deem that to be harassing?
So we'll probably end with the last 1 or 2 questions.
So in terms of the Ontario context, what happens in an incredibly internationalized setting like a university in terms of what's reasonably known or expected to be known within this Ontario context and someone who might be less familiar with this context?
Yes, so the standard test is the reasonable person in Ontario. So an international student, for example, who's unaware of this environment and what's here, their intent may not be to discriminate. They may just be following patterns of behavior they're used to. But in the end, they're held to the standard in Ontario. And essentially, they need to know. If they didn't know, they should know what their obligations are here. So it might be a factor in mitigating remedy. It might be, in terms of what could be asked for. But it's not a factor in the determination of actual discrimination. A person in Ontario, wherever they come from, is expected to uphold the standards of Ontarian society.
Any other questions? One more? Okay, we have one more in the front.
Thank you. Of all the things you presented to us, one of the things that I want to spend a lot more time thinking about were those 9 key aspects or key points about organizational best practice. And in particular, you mentioned planning for resistance. I was wondering if perhaps you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, in the environments we've dealt with, policing, corrections, and so on, resistance comes from different sources. So planning for resistance is actually trying to shape up why people resist, thinking of their different motivations for resistance, and then trying to find pinpoints that might intervene on those sources of resistance. Usually people resist, some people resist just because they don't like change, and other people resist because they object, they don't agree. And some people because they just like to object, it's their nature, right? So you have to actually try to pinpoint the nature and types of resistance and where they're coming from. Some are very understandable, right? Some are things you would almost say as reasonable, and there may be legal frameworks for that. So for example, unions and professional associations might have collective agreements, for example, that they refer to and object on the basis of collective agreements. So all of those are sources of resistance. All of them have to be shaped up individually and responded to as if they were almost they're part of a bigger picture, but they're almost unique elements of that bigger picture. So a more sophisticated kind of shaping up of resistance is what this is essentially calling for. And the understanding that to break that down is often an extended process. And sometimes to deal with resistance, some strategies are like just ignore it. In our police work, we often found that police associations were very resistant to suggestions of issues of racial profiling and discrimination. And the decision of police leaders and chiefs were, well, these people are not going to come alongside on this at this point. So we're going to ignore what they are thinking, and we're going to push ahead. So that's an attitude and a response to a particular kind of resistance. That may be one way to go. The other way maybe is to actually listen to the resistance, is actually to try to bring people on side, and there's different strategies for doing that. So again, it's very contextual, and it's something that needs to be shaped up individually, and specific, unique responses developed for each issue that comes forward.
So on that note, I'd like to join me in thanking Dr. Azmi once again for this dialogue. On behalf of the Division of Human Resources and Equity, Dr. Azmi would just like to thank you with this token of appreciation from the Division and the University of Toronto as a whole. Thank you for engaging with us in such critical dialogue around race-based human rights complaints and our institutional responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I know all of you are very anxious to get back to your rest of your day, but if we can just have a few moments, or if you really need to leave at this time, please do so. But we do have a couple closing remarks before we officially wrap up the agenda and program of today. So for those of you who wish to stay, please remain seated. So before we close, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Azmi and Jody for moderating our Q&A session and for deepening our collective work and commitment at the University of Toronto with respect to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Additionally, I want to remind the University of Toronto community that the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Impact Awards submissions are now open. Yeah. So we would really like to encourage you to view the submissions package online via our website to nominate either yourself, someone you know, or a group that continues to advance anti-racist practice and work either at the institution or within the broader GTA community. Additionally, lastly, I would like to thank those of you who have submitted proposals for our upcoming conference on March 20th, 2020, in partnership with Hart House. And with that, I'm going to welcome Simon Bagg, Program Coordinator for the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, to close officially our program today.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, I would like to begin by expressing a sincere thank you to Dr. Shaheen Azmi for your presentation on such an important topic. Your presentation has certainly increased my knowledge on the Ontario Human Rights Code and the importance of knowing and fulfilling our responsibility when race-based complaints arise. These events are only possible with the ongoing leadership and support of senior administration, including Professor Merritt Gertler, Kelly Hannah Moffat, Vice President of Human Resources and Equity, Sandy Welsh, Vice Provost of Students, and Karima Hashmani, Executive Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We would like to express our deep appreciation to Hart House for co-sponsoring this event with us. A very special thank you to John Monahan, Zoe Dill, Alexandra Kavanaugh, and all members of Hart House who helped with the logistical and technical aspects of today's event. We would also like to acknowledge Media Commons for providing live stream at today's event. Throughout the planning process, we have been very fortunate to have the assistance of a fantastic and very motivated and dedicated group of colleagues, Human Resources and Equity Communications team. Our heartfelt thanks to Haley Fuller, Tom Spence, Will Campbell, and Lisa Holmes for their time and dedication to ensuring the success of today's event. Finally, we would like to thank all of the attendees present here with us today and those joining via live stream. An evaluation survey will be sent to you following today's event. We encourage you to please take a few moments to provide us with your feedback. We look forward to you joining us on January 22nd for our final speaker series event for this academic year, focusing on addressing anti-Semitism in 2020, increasing an inclusive post-secondary environment. The keynote speaker will be Rabbi Julia Appel, Senior Jewish Educator and Campus Rabbi at Hillel University of Toronto. It has been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you and have a great afternoon.